You know, back in the old days, we used to say America led the world with ideas, not intimidation. We built trust through trade, diplomacy, and yes, sometimes sheer optimism. We were the architects, the conveners, the ones who brought nations together at the table. But these days, it feels different, doesn't it? Our alliances sound more like ultimatums, our trade partners, more like pawns on a chessboard. So, let me ask you this. When did standing with America start meaning standing in line behind it? Tonight, we're going to peel back the curtain on Washington's new economic playbook, how the United States is using its allies, not just to contain China, but to reshape the very rules of global power. And I'll tell you, friends, after watching American politics for more decades than I sometimes care to count, this feels like a turning point. Not the kind that makes headlines for a week and fades, the kind that reshapes the world our grandchildren will inherit. I want to tell you about a company you've probably never heard of, Nexperia, and how its story became a window into something much larger and, frankly, more troubling than most of us realized was happening. Let's start with how we got here. For years, we heard about the US-China trade war in terms most of us could understand. Tariffs on lumber, steel, kitchen cabinets, jobs moving overseas, factories closing down. It was framed as an economic problem. Balance the ledgers, bring manufacturing home, level the playing field. And there was truth in that. Real pain in real communities across this country. But somewhere along the way, that trade dispute quietly transformed into something far deeper, far more dangerous. This isn't about balancing ledgers anymore. It's become a systemic battle for control over the entire global economic order. A struggle not just for jobs or market share, but for who gets to write the rules that govern how the world does business in the 21st century. I've lived through the Cold War. I remember when the world was divided into two camps, when every nation had to pick a side, when a trade relationship or a military alliance could define your place in the global order for generations. And I'll tell you something that keeps me up at night. I'm watching that same dynamic return. But this time, the weapon isn't nuclear missiles, it's economics, it's technology. And the battlefield isn't Europe or Korea, it's everywhere, all at once. And at the center of this new doctrine lies a simple but chilling idea. If you can't beat your rival directly, make sure your friends help you do it, whether they want to or not. Let me explain what I mean by that. Washington's approach has evolved into what I'd call weaponized diplomacy. The tools have always been there. Sanctions, export controls, economic pressure, but their purpose has fundamentally changed. They're no longer just defensive measures to protect American interests. They've become offensive, weapons designed to force our allies into a unified front against Beijing, regardless of the cost to those allies themselves. The centerpiece of this strategy is something called the Entity List. Now, if you haven't heard of it, don't worry. Most folks haven't. It's maintained by the Department of Commerce, and it's essentially a blacklist. Any company on that list is cut off from doing business with American firms without explicit government approval. And in our interconnected world, where U.S. technology and financial systems touch nearly everything, that's tantamount to a death sentence for most businesses. In my lifetime, I've seen trade tools become diplomatic weapons, and now they're the ammunition of a new kind of war. The number of Chinese entities on this list has ballooned dramatically, especially after Washington changed the rules to automatically include any subsidiary more than 50% owned by an already blacklisted company. That single rule change added thousands of companies overnight. But here's the crucial part, and I want you to really hear this. The list isn't just aimed at China anymore. It's aimed at our allies. The implicit threat is crystal clear. Align with our economic strategy, or your own critical industries might find themselves on the receiving end of these same debilitating sanctions. You hear the rhetoric from Washington, and it's apocalyptic. Treasury officials talk about China pointing a bazooka at the supply chains of the entire free world. Notice that language, the free world. It's deliberate. It casts this as China versus everyone, a battle between a rogue aggressor and the forces of freedom and democracy. And by framing it that way, any Allied resistance can be painted as naive, or worse, as complicity with the enemy. Now, there's a strange irony at the heart of all this, and it has to do with our current political moment. You have a president whose political survival depends on the stock market. He watches it like a hawk, tweets about it, and measures his success by it. And that creates this bizarre pattern that traders have started calling taco, Trump always chickens out. Here's how it works, and you might have seen this yourself. He'll issue some shocking threat, maybe 100% tariffs on Chinese goods. Markets immediately panic. Billions of dollars vanish overnight. Then, by the weekend, there's a conciliatory post on social media. Don't worry, everything's fine with China. President Xi just had a bad moment. And markets recover. Traders have actually learned to profit from this cycle. They buy the dip, knowing the walkback is coming. But while that public drama plays out, the real policy work continues behind the scenes. The bad cops in the administration, figures you don't see in the headlines as often, they're floating genuinely radical ideas, expelling hundreds of thousands of Chinese students from American universities, sanctioning major Chinese companies listed on U.S. stock exchanges, targeting Chinese firms that buy Russian oil, using the Ukraine conflict as cover to avoid direct market shocks. This is the toolkit, and nowhere is this strategy clearer than in a case that should have stayed in the business section, but instead landed on the front page of world politics. Let me tell you about Nexperia. It's a semiconductor company. Now I know, chips and semiconductors. These aren't exactly dinner table topics for most of us. But bear with me, because this story is about much more than circuits and silicon. It's about power. It's about sovereignty. And it's about what happens when a global superpower decides an ally's company is too valuable to leave in the wrong hands. Nexperia is based in the Netherlands, a European company on paper. But since around 2018, it's been owned by Wolff, a Chinese firm. That dual identity, European face, Chinese ownership, put it directly in Washington's crosshairs. And here's what makes this story so important. Nexperia wasn't failing. It wasn't a security threat in any traditional sense. Under Chinese ownership, it had actually thrived. Wolff took what had been a loss-making European operation and transformed it into a multi-billion-dollar global powerhouse. It ships roughly 100 billion semiconductor units every year. It employs around 14,000 people, with 10,000 of those jobs right there in Europe. By any normal business measure, it was a success story. But its operational reality told a different story, one that made it strategically indispensable to China. 80% of its production happens in China. 70% of its chips, even those made in Europe, have to be sent to China for final processing. Nearly half its sales go to Chinese companies. And critically, Nexperia is a key supplier to the global automotive industry. Its chips are in the cars we drive, made by companies from Detroit to Tokyo to Munich. So, you have this company, essential to both Europe's economy and China's tech ecosystem, deeply woven into global supply chains. And then, one day, the Dutch government seized it, just like that. Overnight. They used an obscure Cold War-era law from 1952 called the Goods Availability Act, legislation designed to secure critical supplies during national emergencies. The Chinese CEO was immediately removed, the entire board suspended, shares frozen. A government-appointed trustee took control. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary act, a democratic ally expropriating a foreign-owned company with stunning speed. The official justification? National security. The Dutch government said losing these chip capabilities could risk economic security. That sensitive technology might leak to China. But that official story, friends, it didn't hold up for long. Because as the details emerged, it became clear this wasn't really the Netherlands acting alone out of security concerns. This was something else entirely. A perfect storm of American pressure, corporate intrigue, and political opportunism. Here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, deeply troubling. In June, months before the seizure, the U.S. administration delivered an ultimatum to the Dutch government. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't diplomatic. Washington explicitly told the Netherlands, remove Nexperia's Chinese CEO, or we will add the company to our entity list. Let that sink in for a moment. The United States of America threatened one of its closest allies, a founding NATO member, a fellow democracy, with the economic equivalent of a death penalty if they didn't comply, with American demands regarding a private company operating on European soil. And this wasn't an idle threat. The Dutch knew it wasn't, because Washington had already used the exact same playbook on ASML. ASML is the crown jewel of the Dutch economy, one of the most valuable companies in Europe, often representing over a fifth of the entire Dutch stock market. For years, the U.S. pressured the Netherlands to block ASML from selling its most advanced machines to China. The Dutch resisted. They tried to protect their flagship company's access to what had been one of its biggest markets. Eventually, they gave in. They had no choice. And ASML's Chinese market was effectively destroyed, inflicting significant damage on the Dutch economy in the process. So, when the same threat came down regarding Nexperia, the message was clear. We've done this before, and we'll do it again. It's like watching an old friend twist another's arm, smiling for the cameras while whispering, "Do the right thing, or else." But the American pressure alone wasn't enough to trigger the seizure. There had to be a pretext, a legal justification that made it look like the Dutch were acting on their own legitimate concerns. And that's where the internal corporate drama comes in. On October 1st, 3 senior Nexperia executives, European nationals, not Chinese, filed an urgent petition with the Dutch courts. They accused the Chinese CEO of corporate malfeasance, claiming he'd forced the company to place an excessive order with another company he was connected to. The accusation was that he ordered $200 million worth of materials when only $100 million was necessary. Now, even if that were true, and that's a big if, this is a textbook corporate governance dispute. You raise it with the board of directors. You follow internal procedures. You don't bypass all corporate channels and run straight to the government of a foreign country asking them to intervene. But that's exactly what happened, and the timing was almost too perfect. The 3 executives who filed that petition, they had a choice. They could have handled this internally, the way businesses have handled disputes for generations. But instead, they went straight to the Dutch courts and essentially handed the government a ready-made excuse to do exactly what Washington had been demanding for months. Some observers called it what it looked like: a corporate coup, an internal power struggle where European executives, perhaps with encouragement from outside forces, colluded with politicians to oust their Chinese superior. And whether by design or by coincidence, it happened at the exact moment when the Dutch government was most vulnerable. You see, the Netherlands was in political chaos. The ruling coalition had collapsed in August. Elections weren't scheduled until late October. The government in power was a caretaker administration, weak, temporary, politically exposed. In that kind of vacuum, a transitional government is uniquely susceptible to pressure. They're not strong enough to resist, not confident enough to take the heat. And when Washington comes knocking with an ultimatum on one side, and internal executives come running with accusations on the other, well, the path of least resistance becomes pretty clear. This wasn't 3 separate things happening at once. This was a perfect storm: external American pressure, a precedent already set with ASML, a convenient internal crisis, and a vulnerable government caught in the middle. And the result was an unprecedented expropriation that triggered exactly the kind of chaos it was supposed to prevent. Because China wasn't about to just sit back and accept this. Beijing's response was swift, surgical, and absolutely devastating. China immediately banned all Nexperia chips from being exported from Chinese territory. And remember those numbers I mentioned earlier? 80% of production in China, 70% of processing in China. The Dutch government had seized the company's name, its European headquarters, its legal structure, but China controlled the actual assets, the factories, the inventory, the production lines, the workforce that actually makes the chips. It was a masterstroke of retaliation. The Netherlands found itself holding a corporate shell, while China held everything that made the company valuable. Then China's Ministry of Commerce made an even bolder move. They declared they would simply make Nexperia a purely Chinese company under their own jurisdiction, effectively rejecting the Dutch seizure entirely. 2 governments, both claiming legal authority over the same company, 2 competing command structures, and caught in the middle, thousands of employees and an entire global supply chain. When the Dutch Commerce Minister, clearly panicking, tried to call his Chinese counterpart to negotiate some kind of exemption or compromise, he was rebuffed. China's message was blunt: There will be no talks until you reverse this illegal seizure. And that's when things got truly surreal. Nexperia essentially tore itself apart. Employees started receiving contradictory orders from two different headquarters. The Chinese operations sent out memos telling workers to ignore any instructions from the new Dutch-appointed management. They assured employees their salaries would continue to be paid by the Chinese side. Hours later, the Dutch headquarters sent their own memo insisting they were in control. Their orders were the only legitimate ones, and they would be paying salaries. In what can only be described as a corporate civil war, the Dutch-controlled entity reportedly fired all Chinese employees, severing the last threads holding the two halves together. You had one company, two masters, thousands of confused workers, and an entire industry watching in horror. Because here's the thing that should keep all of us up at night. Nexperia isn't some minor player. It's a critical supplier to the global automotive industry. And when this supply suddenly got cut off, the ripple effects started spreading immediately. The Alliance for Automobile Innovation, a group representing virtually every major car manufacturer you can name, from General Motors and Ford to Toyota, BMW, and Honda, they issued an urgent warning. If this situation isn't resolved quickly, they said, it will cause significant disruption throughout the entire automobile manufacturing supply chain. Let me just pause here and appreciate the irony. The Dutch government invoked a 1952 law called the Goods Availability Act, legislation whose entire purpose was to protect supply chains and ensure critical goods remain available during emergencies. And by invoking it, by seizing this company, they created the very crisis the law was designed to prevent. They broke the supply chain they were supposedly protecting. You could almost hear the bitter laughter from Beijing. Now, you might be asking yourself, why? Why would the Netherlands do this to itself? Why would any nation deliberately damage its own economy, disrupt its own industries, and alienate a major trading partner? And that's the question that brings us to the heart of what's really happening here. Because the message being sent isn't just to the Netherlands, it's to every American ally watching this unfold. Japan, South Korea, Germany, India, Taiwan. Every nation that finds itself economically integrated with China while security dependent on the United States. The message is simple and chilling. Choose sides. Now. We won't ask twice. For the first time since World War II, America's allies aren't just following. They're being herded. They're being told that their economic sovereignty, their right to make decisions in their own national interest, is secondary to Washington's strategic objectives. And if they resist, they'll face the same arsenal of economic weapons currently aimed at Beijing. Is this leadership, or is it fear? I've watched American foreign policy for a long time, friends. I remember when we led through inspiration, through the promise of prosperity and freedom, through building institutions that lifted all boats. We created the Marshall Plan. We championed free trade. We built a global system that, for all its flaws, brought unprecedented prosperity to billions of people. And now we're using that same system as a cudgel. But make no mistake, this isn't ultimately about one semiconductor company or even about trade relationships. This is about control of the future. And at the center of that future sits a resource as valuable in our time as oil was in the last century: semiconductors. These tiny pieces of silicon, chips smaller than your fingernail, they're the foundation of everything that makes our modern world work. Artificial intelligence, medical devices, military systems, the phone in your pocket, the car in your driveway. The pacemaker keeps your neighbor's heart beating. Everything runs on chips. In the 20th century, nations fought over oil fields. On the 21st, they're fighting over chip factories and the supply chains that support them. And just like with oil, there are choke points, places where control is so concentrated that whoever holds them holds tremendous power. ASML makes the only machines capable of producing the most advanced chips. Taiwan manufactures the majority of the world's cutting-edge semiconductors. And companies like Nexperia, while not making the flashiest chips, produce the workhorses, the mature node semiconductors that go into everything from cars to appliances to industrial equipment. This is what Washington calls the small yard, high fence strategy. The idea is to identify those critical choke points and build an impenetrable fence around them, keeping China outside. We once built fences to protect freedom. Now, we build them around factories. But here's what troubles me, and what should trouble anyone thinking carefully about where this leads. The yard isn't small at all. The semiconductor supply chain is staggeringly complex. A single chip might have components from a dozen countries, processed in three others, designed in a fourth. You can't just pull one thread, like a Dutch company owned by Chinese investors making chips for German cars, without unraveling the entire fabric. And that brings us to what I call the strategic paradox at the heart of this entire approach. The U.S. strategy depends on leverage, on China's dependence on global supply chains that America can influence or control. But by weaponizing that dependence, by using it as a tool of coercion, Washington is giving Beijing every incentive to escape it. China is now pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into building its own domestic semiconductor industry, not because it particularly wanted to. It's fantastically expensive and technically difficult, but because America has made clear that dependence equals vulnerability. Every sanction, every export control, every entity list addition, every forced divestment or seizure like Nexperia, they all tell the same story to Chinese leadership. You must become self-sufficient at any cost. We may win the short game, but we're creating the very bifurcated world we claim to be trying to prevent. I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, friends. I remember what it meant to live in a world divided into two competing spheres: the economic waste, the missed opportunities, the constant tension, the proxy conflicts. And I'm watching with a sense of deep unease as we slide toward that same dynamic. Except this time, it's not about missiles and military alliances. It's about technology and trade. One American-led sphere, one Chinese-led sphere, and every other nation forced to choose which side of the wall they're on. That's the world the Nexperia saga is helping to create. And I genuinely don't know if the people making these decisions in Washington understand that once you tear the global economy in half, you can't easily put it back together. And this playbook, the one used on Nexperia, it's already being deployed on the next battleground: rare earth minerals. These are elements with exotic names most of us have never heard of: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium. But they're absolutely essential for modern technology. Your smartphone needs them, wind turbines need them, electric car motors need them, advanced defense systems need them, and China controls the overwhelming majority of global rare earth production and processing. It's not that the minerals only exist in China, they're found all over. But China invested decades ago in the dirty, complex, environmentally challenging process of refining them. The West, frankly, let that industry go because it was easier and cheaper to buy from China. Now that dependency is seen as a strategic vulnerability, and Washington is building another coalition to counter it. The difference this time? The pressure might actually work, because unlike Nexperia, where the seizure primarily damaged Dutch and European interests, China's export controls on rare earths genuinely threaten every industrial nation. The EU and India have both expressed serious concern. In this case, Washington's interests and allied interests might actually align. The pain is shared, the threat is real, and the coalition might form voluntarily rather than through coercion. But even here, the question remains: are we building partnerships or just creating dependencies dressed up as alliances? Friends, when I step back and look at the whole picture, Nexperia, ASML, the entity list, the rare earth strategy, all of it, I see America at a crossroads. And it's not the kind of crossroads we talk about lightly. We're making a choice, whether we fully realize it or not, about what kind of power we want to be. Do we lead through inspiration and mutual benefit? Or do we command through economic coercion and the threat of exclusion? For all our talk about freedom and democracy, we're now measuring loyalty and compliance. We're telling our oldest friends that their sovereignty matters less than our strategy. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that true power doesn't demand allegiance, it earns it. The Nexperia case is more than a corporate drama. It's a mirror showing us who we've become. And I'm not sure I like what I see reflected there, because here's what history teaches us, and I've lived through enough of it to know this in my bones. Empires that rule through fear eventually lose everyone. The allies you force to your side are not allies. They're hostages waiting for the first opportunity to escape. And the world you fracture out of determination to maintain control becomes a world where control itself becomes impossible. China isn't going to back down. They're going to invest, innovate, and build their own systems. Our allies aren't going to grow more loyal through coercion. They're going to grow resentful, calculating their own interests, waiting for the moment when the cost of compliance exceeds the value of the alliance. And we're going to find ourselves more isolated and less influential than we ever imagined possible. This is the path we're on. So, what does this mean for us? For everyday Americans watching all this unfold? What does it mean for the world our children and grandchildren will inherit? It means we're living through a turning point. This isn't the first time America's tried to reshape the world, but it might be the first time we've done it by force of fear instead of force of faith, by coercion instead of cooperation, by weaponizing the very interdependence that brought unprecedented prosperity to billions. And the tragedy, friends, is that it didn't have to be this way. We could have chosen to compete through innovation rather than restriction. We could have invested in our own capabilities rather than just blocking China's. We could have strengthened alliances through shared benefit rather than ultimatums. We could have remembered that leadership is about showing the way forward, not just blocking the path for others. But we chose differently, and Nexperia, this one Dutch semiconductor company you'd never heard of until today, might be remembered as the moment when that choice became irreversible, when the global order America built began to fracture beyond repair, not because of any external enemy, but because of how we wielded the power we had. That's the real story here, not just chips or trade or corporate seizures. It's about what happens when a nation mistakes dominance for leadership. Folks, I've spent a lifetime watching American politics, studying our place in the world, trying to understand how we got from where we were to where we are. And I'll tell you honestly, this moment worries me more than most. Not because China is a threat, not because technology is changing, but because we seem to have lost sight of the values that made American leadership something other nations wanted to follow rather than something they were forced to endure. If you believe, as I do, that we should lead with wisdom, not just weaponry, with partnership rather than pressure, with a vision of shared prosperity instead of zero-sum dominance, then this story matters. It matters because it shows us the cost of the path we're on, and it matters because we still have the chance to choose differently. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Hit that like button if you learned something new tonight. Subscribe if you want more honest talk about where our world's really heading. And tell me in the comments, is America still leading or just commanding? Because history, my friends, has a funny way of remembering the difference. And right now, we're writing a chapter that future generations will read with either pride or regret. The choice, as it always has been, is ours. Thanks for joining me tonight. Take care of yourselves and each other. And remember, in a world that seems to be choosing sides, maybe the bravest thing we can do is choose wisdom instead. Good night.